In the space of 1 week, the banking system tips into chaos. You should see something like that coming in a trustworthy system. And now it can happen any morning. You go to sleep and the world is fine, and you wake up the next day and it's chaos. Nobody wants to live in that kind of a world, so we're all trying to get out of it. And the process will be fascinating.
Here at Liberty and Finance, we're licensed brokers with Miles Franklin. We are standing by the inventory, ready to make sure you get what you need, even into the wee hours of night and on weekends, because preparedness doesn't stop. Call us 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237.
Welcome back to Liberty and Finance. We're always glad to have this well-followed guest. John Rubino, formerly the head of DollarCollapse.com, is now with us again this Wednesday, March 22nd, 2023. John, thanks for coming back on Liberty and Finance.
Hey, Donegan, good to be back. And congratulations on being so busy now. I hear you guys are selling more gold and silver than you've ever sold in at least Andy Schectman's career, right? So.
Yeah, that's true. It's been very startling to a lot of people who've been waiting for a sign when they saw multiple bank failures in the past 2 weeks. Many are taking that as a sign that the system is in fact as unhealthy as many have been saying it was for the last period of time, and now they're getting down to either taking new action or taking bigger action than they took in the past. And I hope that's good for everyone involved, because I'm really concerned about the people who are still exposed to the risks of this system, who have not yet wakened up, but clearly there's a whole new tier of people that are taking additional action than they've ever taken before.
Yeah, you're referring to the people who had bank accounts last week, right? Who found out that I think there's this huge shock reverberating through the country right now as people figure out that when you deposit money in a bank beyond the insurance limit, that you're basically just an unsecured creditor of that bank, and banks can go bust. This is something that I think was a complete mystery to a lot of people. And now all of a sudden they're realizing it. And that's potentially going to change everything in the banking world.
Well, we've had various people cautioning us about the fragility of this overall global banking system. And I guess it's annoying that it's even a global banking system to start with. For many people who are using a small regional community bank, that sort of thing, they figure it's just our little world where we do our business and that sort of thing. But then to hear that, no, in fact, Credit Suisse Bank falling over, off across the ocean or whatever can suddenly topple the entire global system. So you've got weekend after weekend now of the Fed and others having emergency meetings and starting emergency facilities and that sort of thing to keep injecting liquidity and to keep the system from falling over, while reassuring the populace that the system is, Yellen keeps saying the system is secure and the system is safe, the system is stable. Your view of that, and I want to mention to everybody the reason we grabbed you right now to get on this, because you just wrote an article called "And Just Like That, the Tight Money Era is Over, They Broke Everything." And that's the context that I wanted to take within this. But if you could first, I guess, give us your view of this confusing environment we find ourselves, where people at the helm of our global financial system are telling us the system is stable, and that's why at the same time they're taking unprecedented emergency actions to keep it alive.
Yeah, well, I wrote that article you're referring to on my new Substack feed, which is rubino.substack.com. I finally have something to sell on an interview. To understand that, we need to go just a little bit back, literally just 1 week ago. The consensus in the whole financial world was that the central banks of the world were going to continue to tighten until they broke something. And that was what, for instance, Jerome Powell here in the US was saying, that rates were going to be higher for longer than anybody expects. And because of that, everybody assumed that rates would continue to rise until something broke. But it turns out they'd already broken pretty much everything. And it was just waiting for one specific entity somewhere out there to implode to show us how fragile the system had become. And that was Silicon Valley Bank last week. The story with them, they have kind of a particular story, but also one that can be generalized to the rest of the banking system. They're a bank in they were a bank in Silicon Valley that was very tight with the venture capitalists and the tech startups. And so everybody used them as their local Silicon Valley bank. You know, if a tech startup needed to make payroll, they would deposit the money at Silicon Valley Bank and use that as their checking account to pay their workers and everything. And then other companies were just using it as a savings account to put all their money in, regardless of the level of deposit relative to the FDIC insurance. You know, bank accounts are insured up to $250,000 in the U.S. But Silicon Valley Bank had people putting $1 billion in without apparently understanding that anything above $250,000 made them unsecured creditors of a bank. Well, what happens with bank accounting is that when they've invested in things, the banks, when they've invested in things like bonds, which a lot of banks do, they take their excess deposit money and put it into various kinds of bonds. They have to show the rise and fall of the value of those bonds on their quarterly statements. And if the value of those bonds go down, they have to report a loss. And that's what happened with Silicon Valley Bank. They owned a ton of government bonds, which are basically the safest things in the world in terms of repayment of capital or of principal. You know, you're going to get your money back with a government bond. But the price of those bonds fluctuated downward as interest rates went up, which led to them reporting a big loss. A paper loss, but still a loss. That spooked some Silicon Valley heavyweights who started saying, take your money out of this bank. And so a lot of people pulled money out. A lot of big depositors pulled money out, which forced that bank to sell some of its bonds at a big loss in order to cover the outflows of deposits. And that basically just blew them up. So, you know, in the sense of having $1 billion deposits and things like that, you know, it was kind of an unusual situation. But it turns out that tons of other local and regional banks have problems, not that severe, but similar enough to make them, you know, be risky. And so the problem was going to spread throughout the banking system in the U.S., and it was going to basically cause a stampede out of small banks and into the handful of big giant banks that seem to be impervious to all this stuff because they've got an explicit government backstop. So then the government stepped in and basically just did away with the limit on FDIC deposit insurance, which means taxpayers are now on the hook for all bank deposits. You know, there's nobody out there that's left as a unsecured creditor of a bank that has any kind of incentive to pay attention to what their banks are up to now. You mentioned Janet Yellen. She was speaking before Congress while this was all going on and just made such a hash of it. You know, she is, what can I say? She's a diversity hire. She knows nothing about what she's talking about. And she's the Treasury Secretary. So that spooked people even further when the person who's supposed to know about this stuff and supposed to be making wise decisions basically had no idea what was going on. So here we are with the banking system kind of on the verge, because so many banks have similar problems to those that blew up a couple of banks already. And we've also got an inverted yield curve, which is bad news for the banking model. You know, the business model of a regional or local bank is that you take in deposits, that is, you borrow short term, and you invest in business loans and mortgages and things like that, which are longer term loans. And as long as short rates are lower than long rates, you make money on the spread. But as soon as short-term interest rates go up beyond long-term interest rates, your business model blows up. And that's where most banks are right now. You know, even if the whole bond portfolio fluctuating thing wasn't happening, they would still have a business model that does not work. And so basically, the Fed did raise rates until something broke, and it turned out to be the entire banking system. And now we're in the stage of this process where things start going bad and the government has to step in with bailouts. And they've done kind of sort of the banks. And now we've got all kinds of other things like auto loans and commercial real estate and pension funds and derivatives. All of those things are also threatened by various aspects of the tight money policy that we've been pursuing lately. And there's no way to know which one of those blows up, but it's highly likely that if we continue to tighten, something like that is going to blow up. So it's probable that we're done with the whole increasing interest rates, tightening money, shrinking money supply era. That's over. And even if the Fed tightens today a little bit, they're still not going to be tightening much going forward. And they're going to be doing so many big bailouts that's going to effectively be an easing of monetary policy. So I think it's completely possible that this was the last gasp of tight money in the fiat currency experiment. In other words, we've blown it on such a massive scale that we can no longer fix it. Central banks don't have the tools to fix rising inflation or rising financial instability. And they're going to see one or the other for sure going forward. Either, inflation picks back up because people realize that interest rates are now coming down, or things start blowing up because we allowed the money supply to contract further from here, and governments have to step in and bail out everybody in sight. But that's it. I think it's completely feasible that the experiment that began in 1971 is in the process of a fiery end right now. So, that's why you're selling so many gold and silver coins right now, because people are starting to pick up on, if not the details of all of this, the general sense that things are going wrong on a big scale, and they want safety. So I think that's a trend that is going to continue until it becomes a bubble in its own right.
Well, this is, I guess if we could even back up farther to the big picture of people, as you mentioned, trying to just position themselves so that they can have a life. I think it's just natural human behavior and natural law that people want to be able to look forward to and plan a future for themselves, for their children, for their grandchildren, people who work hard, people who start businesses, people who save, people who try to invest. They just want to understand what's the lay of the land, what are the rules of the road, so that I can do the right thing, be responsible, and have a reasonable expectation of hope in the future. And that's a lot of energy and drive and productivity come from that hope and that expectation of a future that would be better if we apply ourselves. You mentioned Janet Yellen's you were reflecting as incompetence. I think one of the aspects that people see is just bewilderment for the ordinary person. It's like, well, are the rules changing again? Because most people hadn't even figured out the Dodd-Frank Act rules of 2010, where we became unsecured creditors of banks. But now people are being told, we'll just make up the rules as we go. And that's another area where clients ask all the time when buying bullion is, what can I buy so it won't be government confiscated? And they're looking back at the 1933 executive order from Franklin Delano Roosevelt to try to be their guide to whether or not the particular type of gold they buy or something may or may not be confiscatable in the future based on predicting future government action. So it all seems to come back to this idea that people want to know what the lay of the land is, what the rules of the game are, so that they can make reasonable and responsible decisions for their future. Can you address that in terms of the predictability and what happens when the world becomes so arbitrary, unpredictable, that people really have no hope of knowing what's going to come next, where the next risk is going to come from to their future?
Yeah, well, an arbitrary, unpredictable world is the inevitable result of fiat currency. In other words, in 1971, we gave the world's governments unlimited credit cards in the form of monetary printing presses. They could henceforth make as much new money as they want to and just use it to fight wars and invade other countries and buy elections and siphon off to Swiss bank accounts and all the things corrupt governments do. They had a new tool that made it much easier. And so inevitably, we ended up with a system that is basically run by the big banks, in which everybody's increasingly deeply in debt, and financial instability is rising exponentially. So in that kind of a world, no rules matter anymore. Whatever you thought was true 5 years ago stops being true by now. And so that's terrifying to people who aren't, finance nerds who spend all day long focusing on this stuff. You and I, we understand what's happening because we obsess over it. But to the average person who has a life beyond, what's going on in the financial markets on any given day, to them it's completely baffling, because it not only is it sinister and scary, but it keeps changing. So whatever they thought they understood goes away and turns out not to be true. And so it's no surprise that the trust horizon out there is shrinking dramatically. People used to trust, for instance, the big banks, or the public health authorities, or the monetary authorities, or mainstream media, are finding out that none of those guys are telling them the truth, and they're all ripping them off in one way or another. And so the horizon beyond which people don't want to trust anymore is shrinking all the way back to physical precious metals, something you can hold in your hand that is going to stay what it is, basically forever, and local government officials, people who you can see in the grocery store and shake hands with and look in the eye. Those are that's the final line of people that are still trustworthy for a growing number of people. So the whole prepping thing, which used to be a fringe ideology, is now becoming mainstream lifestyle choice for a growing number of people. People want to be able to grow their own food. They want to have a job that isn't dependent on the financial markets. They want to own assets that governments can't create more of out of thin air on a monetary printing press. So everybody wants farmland now. Everybody wants energy stocks. Everybody wants gold and silver. Or not everybody, but a growing number of people. It feels like everybody to you, right? As you're selling gold and the phone's just ringing off the hook. But, there's still several 100 million people who probably don't get this in the US and who will. And when that time comes, when a critical mass of people figure this out, that they cannot trust the guys in charge, and there's nobody left to protect them but themselves. It's going to become a deluge of investable capital trying to get through these little tiny doors of gold and silver miners and precious metals bullion and energy stocks and uranium miners, things like that. Those are small markets, and trillions of dollars are going to want in on that action pretty soon, and that's going to be a feeding frenzy, like we've never seen, certainly in our lifetimes. And the people who are positioned there now are going to have what everybody else wants going forward. So it's going to be, a fascinating time in which the people who get it are positioned in a way that they're not only protected, they're enriched by the decisions that they've made. And then the people who trust the governments of the world, who continue to trust what they see on CNN and what the public health authorities tell them and what the monetary authorities tell them, they're going to be impoverished by this, because those guys are not trustworthy. The big systems are no longer trustworthy. And we're seeing that now as in the space of 1 week, the banking system tips into chaos. You should see something like that coming in a trustworthy system. And now it can happen any morning. You go to sleep and the world is fine, and you wake up the next day and it's chaos. Nobody wants to live in that kind of a world. So we're all trying to get out of it. And the process will be fascinating.
It's especially disconcerting to most people, I believe, when they hear those who are at the wheel of power and should have the visibility of the horizon and so on, telling them and reassuring them all is well, all is well, all is well, right up to the moment when everything falls apart, because they think, well, I'm not going to trust that person next time to be the early warning system that tells me to take shelter.
Yeah, I think, the next time there's a vaccine rollout, or the next time somebody like Janet Yellen says, you've got to do this really stressful thing because it's the right thing to do, and don't worry, we've got your back. People aren't going to listen to that. So we've basically ruined the credibility of huge sections of the elite right now. So what's going to be left for them is probably some kind of coercion. In other words, you make up a crisis, and then you use that as an excuse to impose your will on people. And you could make the case that we've already had a couple of those in the recent past. But I think there's plenty more in the pipeline, and it's just a question of which one they pull out first. Is this going to be World War III? Are we going to have a shooting war with Russia and China? And is the government going to impose martial law when that happens? Are we going to have another pandemic? Monkeypox came and went pretty quickly, but there's no reason why they can't revive it or something else. Is there going to be a cyber attack? Which is that's kind of an evergreen crisis, right? We've been waiting for that to happen for a long time, but let quote unquote hackers take down a big chunk of the banking system, and all of a sudden martial law is going to seem very reasonable to a lot of people. So I think it's completely feasible that we have another false flag crisis here in the not too distant future, and the guys we don't trust, who we would never follow in normal quote unquote normal times, will use that as an excuse to get us to come along with whatever it is they want to do. And I think so the central bank digital currencies are going to be a big part of that story.
It's interesting. There's two aspects of what you just said that I wanted to dig into a little bit. One is this you said when those in power have lost their credibility through their own unreliability, that's been evident, and people see that they have to up the ante to, it's like you didn't do your final report on time. The teacher says everybody has to turn them in right now, or else you're going to get your final grade and it's not going to have your final report. So you pull the fire alarm and all the sprinklers go off and that sort of thing. You find out some way to make sure that the new problem that's created is big enough to basically make the old problem not talked about anymore and go on the back burner. We've seen that happen many times. If you want to expand on that, that's fine. The other one that's related to that is this idea that people who are the most susceptible people, clearly a lot of the masses of people over the last 3 years were quite susceptible to the nonstop 7x24 barrage of messaging that we were getting that was fear-based and became very compliant to things that were arguably unconstitutional, outside the Geneva Convention and the Nuremberg norms and everything like that, to go along with controlling of their life in an almost unprecedented way, in a global way. Recently, there's been some journalists that have done interviews with people in low-income versus high-income neighborhoods and said there's this huge disparity. People who were not willing to go along with these edicts were often some of the least educated and had a distrust of government, a distrust of authority from decades and decades and decades of having experience being done wrong by those in power. And yet it seems like those who are the most compliant are often the most highly educated, that sort of thing. Any thoughts on either of those as far as the loss of credibility by those in power and upping the ante, as you just mentioned, or the susceptibility of people to those lies told by the people in charge?
Yeah, I think it's shocking how easy it was to control people during first of all, during the Trump years, when there were so many fake investigations and things that were just patently absurd, and yet people bought them completely. And then with the pandemic, same thing. And I think it's equally fascinating how the believe it, don't believe it groups broke out. As you said, it's really surprising that the better educated you are right now, the more likely you are to believe that you need that fourth and fifth booster. And the less well educated you are, the more likely you are to have never gotten a shot in the first place. You'd think it would be the opposite, right? People with a minimal education and low access to real information would be easier to manipulate. But it turns out that wasn't the case. There's a long discussion about this that will get really insulting if we go too far into it. And I'm hesitant to say the things that I would say if we're sitting in a bar with a couple of glasses of whiskey or something like that, and then my true feelings about this would come out. But I don't want to go too far into that. Where there's a paper trail. But it is just shocking that it happened that way. And I think governments learned a lesson from it. Now they've got their target audience. They know who can be manipulated, and they're going to focus on them next time around and demonize the other group. And so the game plan is kind of coalescing as governments learn what works and what doesn't with different groups. So I think we should expect them to act on what they've learned in the last decade. And when we expect the broad outlines of this thing, it won't be as surprising, it won't be as terrifying, and we'll be able to act more easily to protect ourselves. But we should be expecting it, so we should be acting now. And take the steps, prep now, and this will be a lot less terrifying and confusing when the time comes.
We've interviewed several times in the past Brad Harris, the founder of FullSpectrumSurvival.net, and he talks about the official warning will always come too late. One of the things is we get these official reassurances, which are patently inaccurate. We also get declarations of crises that in retrospect seem suspiciously convenient to those wanting to maintain and gain power and control over others and to take away their freedoms and their privacy and everything. One of the things you just mentioned was by knowing this ahead of time, we can be better prepared. And that's always true in preparedness in general, is thinking things through, doing scenario discussions, planning, even doing rehearsals, either mental exercises or dry runs of how are we going to live our lives, carry out our decisions, and take action in a thought out manner if this or that might happen. It can be taxing it takes a lot of energy, it takes time, it's uncomfortable to put ourselves in that cognitive dissonance place of thinking, I'm going to start with the presumption that I can't trust those who I should be able to trust, and then move on from that assumption. But specific actions you've talked about in the past about those preparedness steps, you've gotten more specific recently about things that you see realistic that people should consider doing. Anything new that has emerged to you as a priority that maybe wasn't clear to you as a priority in the past as far as preparedness in the face of this kind of untrustworthiness of those who are giving us the official story?
Well, I think it's a matter of emphasis. The basic stuff we should always have been doing, but for instance, when the food supply chains broke a bit during the pandemic, all of a sudden people realized that food isn't just something that's always going to be in the grocery store necessarily, that we ship from Chile or Mexico or Thailand or whatever, and it just shows up here magically. That might not be the way of the world. And I think that now that a big food shortage is on the list of contrived crises that we could see in the next couple of years, and people are starting to get that, the whole food security thing is gaining more emphasis. I think we really, really now need to be figuring out a way to grow half our food. And there's a woman named Marjorie Wildcraft who has a network called Grow Network. It's her company that basically helps people do that. They sketch out ways that, even if you're in an apartment or you have a small house with a tiny little backyard, things you can do to grow some appreciable portion of your own food, so you don't have to worry so much about whether the grocery stores are just going to be emptied out because of some kind of a crisis involving supply chains or a pandemic or whatever happens next. And I think that's becoming bigger relative to the other stuff now than it was in the past. It used to be that do your finances, of course, make sure you can defend yourself, of course, and make sure you grow a little bit of food, of course. Well, now the food thing is getting bigger relative to those other things. The other things are still important, but being somewhat food self-sufficient, I think, is a really big deal now, just because, a food crisis could be on the list of stuff that they try going forward. It's a very logical one because they test drove a small version of that to see how it would work, and it worked pretty well. It spooked people, but didn't lead to riots in the street or anything. So a bigger version of that is completely possible, and we should be taking steps now, because that's not the kind of thing where you can make a phone call and get a bunch of silver coins shipped to your house, but you cannot just today start growing your own food, and a week from now have lots of new food. You got to plan ahead for that. And so that's the kind of thing I think people should be doing right now on a scale that maybe they didn't think they needed to before.
Another one I would like to expand on that you brought up, which was that the playbook, the method of operation of the authorities, apparently one of the most vulnerable places we are sociologically, psychologically, is this idea of one part of a group being pitted against another part of a group. Psychologist Jordan Peterson has done interviews on this, talking about how we're innately wired for what they call in-group preference, meaning that as human animals, we tend to recognize instantly when we see another new person, whether we think that the ways in which they seem to be similar or dissimilar from us, and there's an instinctive kind of a born-in preference for those that we think are like us, and concern about those we think are unlike us. And in some cases, we need to overcome those instinctive reactions so that we can get along with others who are different from us, and that sort of thing. And that's where that's a beautiful part of life. But in this case, the fact that we can almost be played like a player piano if the authorities say, hey, you guys who really care, beware that those people are dangerous to the community, is almost like a button that's almost infallible. You push that button and people will have a very strong reaction to it, and it's very difficult to overcome that. Any thoughts that you have on how we can proactively prepare ourselves to be less vulnerable to that particular type of coercion from authorities, this idea of being played off against each other?
Well, seeing it for what it is the key, and then you can fight it. But of course, the idea that racism and territoriality and things like that are social constructs that are unique to the modern age, it's ridiculous. We evolved from territorial mammals, right? Chimpanzees and wolves, they'll fight to protect their territory, and they'll be incredibly suspicious of anybody who shows up who's not part of their clan. Because that has survival value. So of course we still have those programs running, because we're barely out of the savannah. We're a very young species, and so we carry all that with us. But recognizing that we have it, this problem with suspicion of people who are different from us, and the ease with which that suspicion turns into hatred. It's all real. It's all right there, and it's easily exploited if we don't understand the roots of it and aren't actively trying to control it. And so I think most people haven't thought it through to that point. They just reflexively dislike those who are different. And because of that, they're incredibly easily manipulated. Well, we need to see that because Matt Taibbi, for instance, has done a lot of great work on this subject. He wrote a book called Hate Incorporated about how the big media news outlets have identified this thing we're talking about, this ease with which we mistrust each other, as a business model. So all the different big news outlets have identified one little segment of the population, and they want to freak them out and turn them against everybody else, and in that way get them coming back to that news outlet for more, because there's a crisis. They manufacture a crisis, and MSNBC does it with hyper neurotic, overeducated liberals. Fox does it with nervous, scared old white people, and CNN started out trying to split the difference, but then that didn't work, so they became the anti-Trump network. They're the network for people who hate Donald Trump. And each of those is a viable business model. You can make money by taking, 1/3 of the population and then just riveting them to the screen by terrifying them. And so the media is amplifying this innate problem that humans have as we try to, modernize and become part of a complex global world. And governments, seeing that, are using this to control us. And there's no way around this unless we see it for what it is and fight it. So I think as this idea spreads that we can't trust the big systems, then that necessarily leads to, okay, if what they're telling us is lies, why are those things lies? Oh yeah, because they're playing on our prejudices, and we need to get our prejudices under control, unless we want to be controlled by these guys. So there's a process by which this works, and the shrinking trust horizon is a metaphor or a framework for understanding that I think is really useful. But we're nowhere near there yet. The mainstream media is shrinking, and a lot of the big outlets are dying, and they're being replaced by a lot more trustworthy sources of information, like your show, for instance. But we got a long way to go. I mean, you and I kind of feel like people are coming around, but I think part of that is just because we choose to expose ourselves more to people who get it, and to not spend time with people who are just crazed because of whatever they saw on CNN this week. But I think there's hope, but it's a long process of education.
Another thing you just made me think of that is a proactive step that people can take is to network in their local community. Speaking of that more local trust horizon is by connecting on a common sense, supportive, neighborly way with the local farmers, the local beekeepers, the local people who are in the city council or whatever, realizing that we have more in common than we have a difference. Because one thing you didn't exactly mention was that those in authority are exploiting by they say they want us to overcome racism, yet they're constantly focusing on talking about race. It's like, well, we've even had some very high profile celebrities and that sort of thing who have come from minority backgrounds and risen to very high levels of achievement and income and everything, saying, if you just quit talking about it and let people do what they want to do to cooperate with each other, but it's part of that, as you mentioned, coming down from on high, is that refrain of trying to get us to focus on our differences rather than to see what we have in common. So it made me think about networking in your local community to build those relationships at a deeper multidimensional level so that we're less susceptible, so those relationships can be more resilient in the face of that kind of divisiveness. Any thoughts from you on strategies around that, building those local community relationships?
Well, that's really the single biggest thing we should all be doing, is embedding ourselves in our communities. Because if you're all alone, it doesn't matter if you've got an arsenal and a bunch of gold and silver coins. You're still not going to be in great shape because you're just by yourself. You can't really handle adversity. But if we are part of a community where we've got other people's backs and they've got our backs, and we are information for each other, and we're a source of supply of whatever that we happen to be missing, and we educate each other as we all learn about this stuff together, then we're in way better shape. Remember Game of Thrones? They had a saying, something like, I'm paraphrasing here, but when winter comes, the lone wolf dies, but the pack survives. And that's really how we should be looking at our own existence right now. We need to be part of a pack, of a community that we can trust, and that will help us if we need help. That's one of those things that we should have been doing all along. So much of prepping is just common sense. It's the life we should have been leading since we were old enough to make decisions about stuff like this. And we're coming around to it now because it was much easier to trust the big systems and shop online and just hold dollars in bank accounts and things like that. That was very easy. So we drifted away from the deeper truths about existence, which is what you need to be part of a community. And you need to be around people you trust, and you need to be trustworthy so those people will trust you. And to the extent that people are coming back to that, it's a great thing. It's a shame that these giant crises and this potential civilizational collapse that we're looking at is the thing that is taking us back there. We probably would have been better off if we thought this through 2 decades ago, but better late than never.
Speaking of reliable sources of information, you mentioned our channel, and I'm grateful for that. Your new Substack feed, which is rubino.substack.com, is available. I keep seeing your articles coming out on a weekly basis, and the level of perceptiveness and the clarity of the writing and the efficiency with which you get across what could be, very complex topics, but in a very common sense way, I find very refreshing. So we'll put a link to your site, rubino.substack.com, in the description of this video. Please tell people how they can get involved and how they can continue to benefit from that on an ongoing basis.
Well, the Substack feed that I'm doing now is geared towards actionable ideas. In other words, you and I talked a lot about the generalities here, and what I'm focusing on with the Substack is the specific stuff we can do. Which junior miners do you want to own stock in, and why? And should you have more gold or more silver, and how you should buy them? Things like that. You can just show up there at rubino.substack.com, and there's choices of access. You can sign up for a free subscription, which gives you, I would say, 2/3 to 3/4 of what I publish. And then there are paid subscription levels where the real investment advice and other kinds of actionable stuff are to be found. But a lot of people start with a free subscription, see what they think of it, and then decide to step up to get the other stuff. And that's probably the simplest way to go about getting familiar with what I'm doing.
I wanted to include, if we could, also in this video, a chart that you put in your most recent article about the topic. And just like that, the tight money era is over. They broke everything. It's a chart of the Federal Reserve balance sheet, something that people are not seeing on the nightly news. Speaking of untrustworthy sources of information, but that I think would be eye-opening and thought-provoking for everyone. We'll put it here at this point in the video if you want to give people an idea of why it's important that they be aware of what's going on and why it mirrors some of the explosion of our currency that happened back in the pit of the spring of 2020, when the trillions sprung out of nowhere that are now causing these inflationary changes, these rises in interest rates and depression of bond values. That's going to hurt companies, hurt governments, etc.
Well, yeah, the Fed's balance sheet is something that people toss around a lot. It's a term that I bet most people don't know what it means. And basically what it is a measure of how much new currency the central bank has created out of thin air and dumped into the financial system. So when it's rising, that means lots of new money is being created and we have an easy money environment. And then when it starts to shrink, that means the Fed is pulling money out of the system. And so it's been rising and rising and rising until just lately, when the Fed started tightening and its balance sheet started shrinking, which is to say the money supply started going down. Well, that all just blew up. And now the Fed has had to go back into the markets and intervene by bailing out the banks. And its balance sheet just spiked. In like the last 2 weeks, it's up by $300 billion with no real end in sight. So that's probably really the only chart you need if you're talking about whether it's easy or tight money right now and which way we're headed. And it illustrates the fact that the brief little period of tight money that we've seen here is over. And we're back to easy money, probably not in the not too distant future, excessively low interest rates, and all the financial instability that implies.
Well, John, we're always grateful for your presence here. Folks, so that you don't miss a single episode with John, and we had him back more often than you would have expected because of this special article that came out, make sure you sign up for our free newsletter so you get all of our new interviews in your inbox, one email per day, by going to libertyandfinance.com, put in your name, your email address, click submit, and make sure you acknowledge on the confirming email. Then you're in, and you won't miss a single interview, including those with John Rubino from rubino.substack.com. John, thanks for joining us here again on Liberty and Finance.
Thanks, Donegan.
Miles Franklin Precious Metals is one of America's oldest and most trusted bullion dealers. Miles Franklin is A+ rated and accredited by the Better Business Bureau, licensed and bonded, and has 0 complaints ever registered. Here at Liberty and Finance, we are licensed brokers with Miles Franklin. To order, simply call us, discuss your needs, and we can let you know our live inventory, prices, and availability, and lock in your order over the phone. Once your order is locked, the price is held for you regardless of market fluctuations, and the metals are reserved for you awaiting your settled payment. Within 1 business day of ordering, you will receive an email invoice detailing the order and payment instructions. Miles Franklin accepts payments by bank wire, ACH or electronic check, money order, check mailed priority mail, and cryptocurrency. The fastest forms of payment are bank wire and cryptocurrency. Upon settled payment, metals will ship out within 3 to 5 business days. You will receive tracking information via email. Domestic shipping charges are $15 for any order under 500 ounces of silver or 10 ounces of gold. For orders larger than that, domestic shipping is free. The package will be boxed, fully insured, and labeled discreetly, with no indication of the contents inside. For your privacy, the name Miles Franklin will not even be on the package. To talk to myself, Kaiser, my brother Elijah, or my father Dunnigan, call 1-888-81-LIBERTY. That's 1-888-815-4237.